you about how do you perceive India in view of recent events, both politically and economically, and how do you see that position evolving during Prime Minister Modi's second term?
Sure. Look, first of all, I have enormous respect for Dr. Jaishankar. Indeed, we were on stage while he was enjoying his private sector experience at that time. As all of us who have been in government have found, I've often noted that I have come to realize that the greatest calling in life beyond government service is the private equity industry. And he was...
I've gone the other way.
Well, it's not a bad path either. And you had a reasonable level entry job as well. Look, and I also knew him, by the way, as foreign secretary. So there's quite a lengthy relationship that he has had. And he really, the relationship that he had with the U.S. stems back to his time when he was in the Foreign Office. And I think in the late 80s, certainly in the 90s, played a big role in a number of the agreements that we had as the U.S.-India relationship evolved since, say, the Clinton administration, quite strongly through the Bush administration, continued with Obama, and indeed into the current administration as well. And this has particularly blossomed on the defense side, where, of course, we had under Secretary Mattis, my old shipmate from the past in uniform, the change of the name of U.S. Pacific Command to Indo-Pacific Command. This is not just a change of a title. This is not just symbolic. This is highly substantive. And we saw one agreement after another on logistics, on communications, and so forth. These seem very arcane and very technical, and actually they are, except that they're also very, very substantive, and they have a great deal of meaning. At the same time, you see India evolving from a period where, it was the leader of the non-aligned movement, still to a degree a proud member of the BRICS. And my reference at that time on stage at the Raisina Dialogue was to, in a sense, gently nudge, with great respect, India to realize that, while certainly it's going to be India first, and of course it was one of your peer predecessors a couple of centuries ago, Palmerston, Lord Palmerston, who famously said, England has no permanent allies, it only has permanent interests. But the truth is, I think that India's interests are evolving. And they are evolving beyond the, again, non-aligned movement or the BRICS. I mean, is it the BRICS with which India wants to be associated in the future, the largest democracy in the world, that's just held the largest democratic election ever in the world, is poised to surpass China in population. And I hoped that the second term for Prime Minister Modi really is the Modi moment that many of us had expected might transpire during the first term in office. Without attribution, I'll mention that someone who is now quite close to Prime Minister Modi called me up one time. I'd left government, he was still in it, and asked if we could meet for lunch in Washington, and was interested in books on second-term presidencies. Now, what I took from that, this is early in the first term of Prime Minister Modi's, and what I realized from that, there was quite an insight that, Prime Minister Modi has found that running India is not quite so easy as running Gujarat, and you don't have quite the absolute power. And indeed, at that time, he didn't have the control of the parliament that he has now. I mean, this is quite a remarkable electoral result. The truth is that many people, I think, were giving a shot at the opposition of actually taking him down. And in fact, he had a resounding victory, and he now enjoys a much greater majority in the lower house, and presumably, and I guess it's a couple of years, we'll probably follow that with the upper house. So I think he has the opportunity now to move past the reforms that he did in his first term, some of which, frankly, took a lot longer than we expected. GST, we thought was a gimme. This is like, a 2-foot putt, and it turned out to take, I don't know how many years in the end, 3.5 years or so, and then there were a lot of little issues that it made it less than the kind of complete deal that a lot of us had hoped for. The bankruptcy law finally was done. Again, something we thought could be done earlier. Demonetization has spurred the digital economy, certainly, but there are obviously some uneven results of that, and the, if you will, the spontaneity with which that was pursued was a bit surprising as well.
Maybe if I can ask you about India first in the context of the long historical ties between both Russia and Iran, and you referred to that. And the Iran topic is obviously highly, highly pertinent, and you've actually been very perceptive in anticipating the current escalating tensions with Iran. I'd be very curious to know whether you think President Trump has an exit strategy from that situation. No doubt it'll dominate the G20 discussions in Osaka. And could India act as a, if Jaishankar was there, he could say, look, the advantages of us being non-aligned and having a relationship with Russia, with Iran, maybe in Russia, is that we can act as a intermediary, maybe as an honest broker alongside Japan.
I would not dismiss that likelihood, but at the end of the day, I'm less concerned about who brokers the, it could be Oman, it could be Switzerland. We've reached out through Oman reportedly. According to the New York Times, Iran has reached out through Switzerland and said we don't want war. Again, if it's Japan, although I thought it was a bit unseemly for Japan's prime minister to be meeting with the leader of Iran at the same time, the visible state, at the same time the Iranian deep state, presumably the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps Navy, is carrying out an attack against a Japanese flagged ship. By the way, nothing showed more the reality that we often forget, that Iran actually has two different states. Yes, they're both overseen by the supreme leader, but there is a visible state with an elected president, certainly from a list that is approved by a council, elected parliament, ministers, and Army, Navy, Air Force. But then there's the deep state, which actually controls the policy for Iran that matters most to a lot of us. This is again, the Revolutionary Guards Corps with its Army, Navy, and Air Force, the Quds Force of the Revolutionary Guards Corps, which is a cross between the CIA and Special Operations and has caused, they were responsible for over 600 deaths of our soldiers with the weaponry, the explosively formed penetrators they provided to the Shia militia in Iraq during my time in command there.
But on the economic front, the Belt and Road Initiative remains a source of considerable anxiety in Delhi, and all the BRI projects that encircle India. In your view, how does, and to use a sort of colourful metaphor, how does the Indian tiger learn to coexist with the Chinese dragon?
Well, again, it always helps, I think, to get the big ideas right, if you will. And I alluded to this earlier, actually from a U.S. perspective. I think it is that the tiger has to be very firm with the dragon, but not provocative. And as I mentioned earlier, I thought this was masterfully demonstrated, again, in the Doklam crisis. Very, very interesting to see how that played out, because it was the firmness that ultimately, I think, led to an assessment by the other side that this is just not worth pursuing, even though the tactical advantage at that location was very considerable for China. And so, again, I think exemplary of what actually the U.S. should have done in some earlier circumstances, and still should use as a guiding principle as we go forward with our relationship, by the way, not just with China, but also with Russia, frankly also with Iran, and arguably also with North Korea, which are the four leading revisionist countries of the world. That is, are not satisfied with the status quo. They want to revise it, some of it in a somewhat revolutionary way, and China in a more evolutionary way, but in some cases with some goals that are seemingly less legitimate, I guess you would say. And then as CIA director, and in the latter two in particular, worked very, very hard to build a relationship with what are arguably the two key leaders of Pakistan, those being the Chief of Army Staff and the Director of ISI, the Inter-Services Intelligence. Not to say that I ignored the President or Prime Minister, depending on who was up at the various time, you know.
Well, Mohammed bin Salman did.
So, and had our hopes dashed. I forget who it was that used to describe Pakistan as our favorite frenemy, that it was a friend whom we were trying to help. I mean.